The morning air was crisp outside the King County Courthouse, a pale Seattle sky stretching over the gray stone building like a lid over a boiling pot. Margaret Fletcher stood on the granite steps for a moment, breathing deeply, her gloved hands clutching the worn leather strap of her folder. Inside it, her final hope, her quiet weapon, she had barely slept. The hotel room was too quiet, the sheets too stiff, and her thoughts too loud. She kept replaying what her attorney, her former attorney, had told her weeks ago before quitting the case. It's going to be tough without representation, Margaret. His legal team doesn't play fair. But Margaret knew something he didn't. She knew how contracts worked. How to read past the noise and straight to the clause that mattered. The courtroom was already filling when she entered. Cherrywood walls gleamed under soft lighting, and the judge's bench loomed in silent authority. She walked past row after row of tailored suits and cold stares, finally settling alone at her table. Across from her sat Robert, her ex-husband, flanked by 3 attorneys in tailored gray. He wore a charcoal suit, gold cufflinks, and that smirk she had once mistaken for confidence. Miss Fletcher, the clerk nodded toward her. She gave a tight smile. Robert leaned toward his attorney and whispered something. Then, loud enough for the courtroom to hear, he chuckled and said, "Let her try." His voice echoed, drawing a few light laughs from the peanut gallery behind him. Margaret didn't blink. She'd expected this. After 30 years of marriage, she knew how he operated, always underestimating, always charming in public, always cruel in private. He'd spent years building a narrative that she was unstable, controlling, emotionally fragile. But Margaret knew something else too. She knew the power of evidence. Of patience. The judge, a woman in her late 50s with stern eyes and a no-nonsense tone, cleared her throat. This is the final hearing in the matter of Fletcher versus Fletcher, regarding the contested revision of the family trust. Miss Fletcher, you are representing yourself. Are you prepared to proceed? Margaret rose. Her knees ached, but she moved steadily. I am, Your Honor. Please begin. She opened her folder carefully, revealing a stack of annotated documents. Her fingers were slow but sure as she flipped to a specific page in the amended trust. In 2019, she began, my ex-husband and I made joint revisions to the Fletcher family trust, specifically after the sale of our construction company. She paused, glancing briefly at Robert, who sat reclining with his arms crossed. At the time, we agreed to revise the distribution clause to reflect our separation. I have here the notarized amendment filed that same year. She held it up. I'd like to draw the court's attention to Clause 14b, subsection 2. She read clearly, each word hitting the air like a stone dropped in still water. In the event that either party remarries, cohabitates in a conjugal relationship for a period exceeding 6 months, or otherwise receives independent financial support equivalent to 60% or more of their prior marital income, said party shall forfeit all claims to residual trust assets unless otherwise amended in writing by both trustees. The room shifted. One of Robert's lawyers straightened in his seat. The judge raised an eyebrow. Margaret continued, calm and deliberate. Robert Fletcher has been living with Ms. Karen Duvall, his partner, for 19 months. They maintain joint accounts, share property, and have publicly represented themselves as domestic partners. Robert sat up. His smirk had evaporated. He turned to whisper sharply to his nearest attorney. Therefore, Margaret said, folding the page back and looking directly at the judge, per the amendment we signed together and notarized, Robert Fletcher forfeited all claims to the trust as of last year. I am submitting documentation to that effect. A long silence fell. The judge took the document, reviewing it carefully. She gave a short nod. Submission received. Counsel. For Mr. Fletcher, do you wish to respond? But none of them spoke. Robert's face was taut. Behind him, the amused gallery was quiet now. Margaret sat down slowly, heart pounding beneath her calm exterior. She didn't need to win the room. She just needed the truth to be heard, and she had just spoken it. In the quiet after Margaret sat down, she allowed herself one small glance across the room. Robert wasn't looking at her. He was looking at his attorney, whispering with tight lips and shallow breath, the back of his neck already blotching red. That color. She remembered it well. He used to turn that same shade whenever he realized he was no longer in control. The judge called for a short recess to review the documents. Margaret stood and moved slowly toward the hallway outside the courtroom. The marble floors echoed with footsteps, voices low and urgent around her, but she heard none of it. Her heart was still racing. She leaned against the cold wall, one hand gripping her folder tightly, the other clutching her phone like a lifeline. There were no messages. She hadn't told anyone she'd be doing this alone. Not her sister in Ohio. Not her daughter in Denver. It was better that way. Alone was something Margaret had learned to live with, not in the tragic, cinematic way people talked about, but in the quiet, daily kind of way. It was what remained after years of being ignored, corrected, dismissed, and made to feel invisible in her own home. After a while, you learn to carry your own silence like armor. She remembered how the smirk began. It wasn't always cruel, it started with charm. That lopsided, dimpled half-grin he wore the first time they met at a subcontractor mixer back in 1982. She was 30 then, just 2 years into a contract management role at a mid-sized architecture firm. He was brash, funny, and relentlessly confident. They danced that night in a small Seattle bar with sticky floors and a broken jukebox. He told her she was too sharp for a place like this, and she laughed because, back then, she believed it was a compliment. The charm had a rhythm: praise, tease, control. At first it was, "You're brilliant with numbers," then, "You worry too much," then, "You'd be happier if you let me handle the big stuff." Before she realized it, she was signing over property rights, letting him restructure the business they co-owned, letting his name come first on every title, every document, every public-facing deal. She managed contracts for clients worth millions. But at home, she couldn't negotiate her own voice into the room. 5 minutes, the clerk announced, snapping Margaret back to the hallway. She walked slowly back into the courtroom. Robert was already at the table, his jaw clenched now, the playful air replaced by something colder. His attorneys had recomposed themselves, laptops open, pens moving fast. But they hadn't looked at her once. The judge returned and took her seat. "This court acknowledges receipt of the 2019 trust amendment and supporting documentation. Unless opposing counsel has material evidence to the contrary, we will proceed with this basis for judgment." One of Robert's lawyers stood, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, we request a continuance to verify the amendment's validity and examine the context of the clause." Margaret's voice cut in, steady. "The notary is available by phone. I've included their contact and the registration number in the packet." She tapped the folder again. "And I have the original email from Robert approving the language, sent from his firm's account." She wasn't supposed to interrupt. She knew that. But the years had trained her not to speak, not to object, not to take up too much space. This moment wasn't about protocol. It was about reclaiming air that had long belonged to her. The judge looked at Robert's attorney. "You'll have a chance to contest the signature's authenticity if needed, but absent immediate counter-evidence, I will not delay." A new expression flickered on Robert's face, less anger now, more disbelief. He had never seen her speak like this, not even during their divorce hearings. Back then, she had been polite, deferential, exhausted. She had taken what she could get and walked away. But this wasn't about alimony or household furniture. This was about dignity. This was about erasing the assumption that she would never fight back. "Miss Fletcher," the judge said, "do you wish to make a closing statement?" Margaret rose, hands calm at her sides. "No, Your Honor. The documents speak for themselves." There was a beat of silence. The judge nodded. "Very well. The court will review and reconvene for a final ruling tomorrow morning at 10. The gavel came down. Margaret exhaled, long and slow. As she gathered her things, Robert finally spoke, not to her, but to one of his lawyers. His voice was lower now. "How the hell did she get that?" And Margaret, walking past him, stopped just long enough to turn her head. "I kept copies," she said, without breaking stride. Outside, the sky had darkened. Rain was beginning to fall, soft and steady on the pavement. She stepped into it without rushing, letting it wash over her like something clean. Something earned. The rain had tapered to a light drizzle by the time Margaret reached her car. A silver Toyota Camry with faded trim, it waited in the same lot she used for every court appearance. She unlocked it, slid into the driver's seat, and just sat for a moment, fingers resting on the steering wheel. The heater groaned to life, fogging the windshield from the inside. Still, she didn't move. She hadn't expected to feel this hollow, not victorious, not vindicated. Just emptied. Outside the window, the courthouse stood in silence behind her. A place she'd entered week after week with documents, timelines, and facts, not because she wanted a fight, but because she couldn't let her life story end in someone else's version. Robert's version. That they'd spent 3 decades together, married for 28. Their construction business, R&M Projects, had started as a side hustle in the late 80s, born in their garage with nothing more than a second-hand drafting table and a shared dream. Margaret had handled contracts and client acquisition. Robert had been the face, charming, persuasive, good at shaking hands and closing deals. People liked him. Clients trusted him. But behind closed doors, Margaret carried the structure. She kept track of expenses, timelines, compliance, zoning issues, all the invisible machinery that made things work. She never minded the backstage role. At first, it even suited her. She was meticulous, steady, and rarely needed the spotlight. But over time, something shifted. Robert stopped treating her as a partner and started treating her like a subordinate. He began making decisions without her. Changing prices. Signing contracts without review. When she pushed back, he'd wave her off. "Let me handle this," he'd say. "You get too bogged down in the details." The irony was bitter. Details were what saved her today. She pulled into the driveway of her modest, two-bedroom home. Just afternoon. The hydrangeas she planted last spring were still in bloom, soaked now from the morning rain. She stepped inside and dropped her folder onto the kitchen table, the weight of it landing like a soft thud against the wood-framed photo sat by the coffee pot, her daughter, Anna, at her wedding in 2010. Robert wasn't in that picture. He'd stormed out an hour before the ceremony after Margaret asked him to sit quietly during the rehearsal. "You're trying to control everything," he had hissed. Like always. That had been the moment Margaret realized the control he accused her of was really just resistance to being erased. She made a cup of chamomile tea and sat down at the table. The folder lay open now, papers slightly askew, highlighter marks glowing faintly under the kitchen light. She reached for a page at random, her eyes scanning familiar lines of legalese. Clause 14b.it had started as a simple suggestion during mediation, something her last attorney floated when she and Robert were still technically working together on estate planning. They had agreed, on paper, at least, to preserve the trust for Anna and her future children. But Margaret had known better. Robert always found loopholes. So she insisted on protections. Quietly, carefully, she drafted addendums. She asked a retired paralegal friend to look them over. She had them notarized at different times, at different banks, to avoid drawing suspicion. When the final trust package was filed, Robert barely skimmed it before signing. He had always relied on her to manage the fine print. And he had assumed, wrongly, that she still worked for him. The next morning came quickly. Too quickly. Margaret stood before her bedroom mirror in a navy blouse and gray slacks, her hair pulled back neatly, silver strands catching the morning light. She looked at herself closely, not in judgment, but in recognition. This was a woman who had carried a company, a family, and her own quiet strength for 61 years. She arrived at the courthouse 20 minutes early. The waiting room outside courtroom 3B was quiet, save for a young couple arguing in hushed tones nearby. She took a seat by the window, watching clouds move across the sky like slow ships. At exactly 10 a.m., the clerk called them in. Inside, Robert looked different. Tired. Less sure. His lawyers stood behind him, rigid but quiet. The judge took the bench and adjusted her glasses. "This court has reviewed the documentation submitted by Ms. Fletcher and finds it valid and binding. The amendment to the Fletcher Family Trust, dated June 3, 2019, includes a forfeiture clause triggered by specific cohabitation terms. The court accepts the supporting evidence presented." Robert didn't move. Accordingly, the judge continued, "Mr. Fletcher is hereby removed as beneficiary of the residual trust assets as outlined. Ms. Fletcher retains authority as sole trustee until further notice." There was a long pause. A silence that felt sacred. "Court is adjourned." The gavel echoed again, final this time. Robert's attorney leaned toward him, speaking quietly. Robert didn't respond. He simply stood, adjusted his cufflinks out of habit, and walked toward the exit without looking back. Margaret gathered her folder for the last time and rose to leave. Outside, the air was still. No rain. No wind. Just a soft Seattle morning and the low hum of traffic. She walked to her car with even steps, her posture calm. Not proud. Not triumphant. Just steady. The truth had been spoken. And for the first time in a long time, no one had tried to talk over her. The courthouse felt smaller as Margaret walked away from it, like a place that no longer held power over her. She didn't look back. Not at the heavy wooden doors. Not at the broad marble steps. Not at the ghosts of a fight that had dragged on for nearly 2 years. It was over, but peace didn't arrive the way she thought it would. It didn't flood in like light through an open window. Instead, it settled slowly, like dust after demolition, quiet, fine, and easy to overlook unless you paid attention. Margaret stopped at a corner cafe on her way home. She hadn't eaten since early the day before. She ordered a toasted bagel and a cup of black coffee, then took a seat by the window. Outside, the city moved like it always did, buses groaning past, people crossing streets with headphones in, the rhythm of ordinary life in motion. None of them knew what had just happened 2 blocks away. None of them knew how long she had carried this weight. She took out her phone and opened the email she hadn't touched in weeks, the one Anna had sent from Denver. Subject: "You sure you don't want me there? I can fly in. I can take time off. You shouldn't have to go through this alone again. Just say the word. Love you." Margaret had never replied. She hadn't wanted her daughter to see her fight this battle. Not because of shame, but because Anna had already seen too much. She tapped out a message now, her fingers moving slowly across the screen. To Anna Fletcher. Subject: All done, the hearing's over. It went in my favor. I'm fine. Just tired. Hope things are good with you and Chris. We'll talk soon. Love, Mom. She hovered a moment before pressing send. Then, slowly, she did. The drive home was quiet. Every traffic light felt like a full stop. By the time she pulled into her driveway, the weight of everything, the hearing, the tension, the years, had begun to settle in her shoulders like a cold she couldn't shake. Inside, she laid her coat on the banister and walked into the den. The late morning sun filtered through lace curtains, painting delicate shadows on the hardwood floor. She moved toward the built-in bookshelf, her eyes landing on the old photo albums she hadn't touched in years. She pulled one out at random. 1994 to 1999. Back when Anna was still in grade school and the business was beginning to take off, page after page, the images told a story she could no longer quite trust. Christmas mornings, birthdays, vacation shots, smiles caught mid-laughter, hands held, arms wrapped around shoulders. But she remembered what wasn't captured: the meetings Robert scheduled on anniversaries, the decisions made without her, the dismissive looks when she brought up money or risk or liability. How he began talking about her in the third person at conferences: my wife handles that, or she's great with forms, as though she were a department, not a person. And still, she had stayed. Not out of weakness. Not out of fear. But because people like Robert made you doubt your version of things. They smiled when they cut you down. They held your hand while they erased your name from things you helped build. She paused on one photo, Anna and Robert standing in front of the first major project they'd landed, a Madras condo complex near Lake Union. Margaret had negotiated the entire contract: zoning, labor, vendors. Her name didn't appear once in the press release. That was what he left behind. Not money. Not even grief. Just omissions. All the places where her name should have been. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table with a blank notepad. She wrote a single line across the top: to whom it may concern. Then she paused. She wasn't sure what this would become: a letter, a journal, a warning, a guide. Maybe just a record. She started writing. I stayed silent for too long. I thought dignity meant not pushing back. I thought strength meant enduring. But silence can be its own kind of surrender. I want to be clear, now. This is what happened. She didn't stop writing for an hour. When her hand finally slowed, the page was nearly full. She hadn't written like this in years. Not since grad school. Not since before Robert. She looked at the final paragraph and realized, almost with surprise, that she had used the word I more than a dozen times. Not we. Not he and I. Just I. Later that night, she opened a bottle of wine, a cheap Pinot Grigio she'd been saving for no reason, and sat on the back porch under a wide navy sky. The air was cool. Crickets chirped in the bushes. Across the street, porch lights flickered on one by one. She drank slowly, savoring the stillness. The clause had removed his name, but what mattered more, what would take time, was putting hers back where it always belonged. 3 days passed before Anna called. Her voice came through Margaret's phone just after breakfast, a little breathless, like she'd been pacing or waiting for the courage to dial. Mom, she asked, as if uncertain the line had connected. You okay? Margaret had been washing dishes, sleeves rolled to her elbows, a quiet morning ritual she hadn't rushed in years. She dried her hands on a kitchen towel and picked up the phone. I'm okay, she said simply. You should have let me come, Anna replied, the edge in her voice part concern, part hurt. I wanted to be there. I was ready to be there. No, Margaret said, walking slowly toward the dining table. But I needed to do it alone. There was a pause on the other end. A long one. Anna finally spoke again, quieter now. Did he say anything? At the hearing? Margaret hesitated. Nothing worth remembering. The silence between them wasn't hostile, it was heavy with shared history. Anna had grown up in the margins of her parents' marriage, just old enough to sense tension but not old enough to name it. She'd learned early that her father's moods shaped the tone of the house, whether the air was brittle with silence or thick with forced laughter. I remember when you stopped sitting at the same table, Anna said suddenly. Margaret didn't respond right away. She knew what her daughter was referring to: the kitchen table, early 2000s, when Robert began eating late or out, always with some excuse. Meetings, client dinners, networking events. She hadn't realized Anna noticed. I didn't know how to explain it to you, Margaret finally said. You were 13. I thought I could protect you by not saying anything. Anna exhaled on the other end. I wish you'd said something. I would have believed you. It was a soft ache, that sentence. So simple. So late, after the call, Margaret stayed at the table for a long time. The house hushed around her. She reached into her folder again, the one that had become a fixture on the table like salt or napkins, and pulled out the final letter Robert had sent through his attorneys, weeks before the last hearing. It was thick with legal language but Brittle with subtext. He'd asked for access to the residuals of the trust. Framed it as a fairness issue. Called their shared business history a foundation of mutual investment. But Margaret saw it for what it was, a bid to reclaim ownership of a narrative he thought he controlled. She took a pen and wrote across the top of the letter in blue ink, "Not yours anymore." Then she filed it away. That afternoon, she walked down the block to the local mailbox. She had a letter of her own to send, an old one, never delivered. Back in 2016, she'd written Robert a draft letter during one of the worst months of their separation. She had found him transferring business funds into a private account, something he'd sworn not to do during the mediation process. She wrote the letter not to accuse him, but to explain how deeply he'd violated her trust, how that betrayal was bigger than the money. How it was about erasure. But she never sent it. She folded it and tucked it in a drawer, afraid it would only start another cycle of denial and blame. Now, she printed a fresh copy. "Robert, I've spent more years than I care to admit believing that if I was calm enough, agreeable enough, or patient enough, you would see me as your equal again. That never happened. The business we built, the family we raised, the years we shared, they all mattered. But your version of those things left no space for mine. You said, let her try, as if effort was something new to me. I've been trying for 30 years. You just finally noticed." She signed it. Folded it cleanly. Slid it into an envelope. But she didn't write an address on it. Instead, she walked to the mailbox, lifted the lid, and dropped it in anyway, not because he'd read it, but because she needed to let go of what she hadn't said. That night, the house was quiet again. But something in the stillness had shifted. It no longer felt like absence. It felt like space. She lit a candle on the mantel. Cooked herself a full dinner, rosemary chicken, roasted potatoes, and a small glass of wine. And when she sat down to eat, she did something she hadn't done in years. She set a second plate across the table, not for Robert. Not for memory, for herself, for the woman who had finally spoken. The following week arrived with the kind of stillness Margaret had forgotten how to sit with. No hearings. No emails from attorneys. No tension hiding in the edges of her mornings. She woke up earlier than usual, not out of worry, but out of habit, as though her body hadn't yet accepted that it no longer had to brace for battle. On Tuesday morning, she found herself driving without purpose, turning down streets she hadn't visited in years. Eventually, she pulled into the industrial district where R&M Projects had leased its first office back in 1991. The building still stood, a squat red brick structure wedged between a printing shop and an HVAC supplier. The company had moved years ago, but she'd wanted to see it again. It was funny how buildings remembered what people tried to forget. She sat in her car, engine off, fingers resting on the steering wheel. The front door still had the same dent in the frame where a delivery truck had backed into it during a concrete job gone wrong. She'd handled the insurance claim herself. Robert hadn't even known it happened until she brought the check home. Across the street was the old cafe they used to order from on Fridays, turkey sandwiches and split pea soup, always on the company card. She remembered sitting in the cramped back office, reviewing supplier bids and subcontractor proposals while Robert worked the charm offensive in client meetings. Back then, she'd told herself their dynamic was strategy. That they made a good team. That he took the meetings so she could focus on what mattered, but over time, his name had started appearing on contracts she hadn't reviewed. He stopped CCing her on project approvals. Clients she'd negotiated with were redirected to his assistant. And one day, without ever consulting her, he had the office door relettered. Fletcher Construction and Development. She hadn't even been at the office that day. A subcontractor mentioned it in passing the next week. It hadn't been a fight, not exactly. More of a quiet, sharp realization. That her name had been removed long before she'd filed for divorce. Long before Clause 14b. It started with the door. The emails. The press releases. Every subtle exclusion. Back then, she said nothing. She told herself it wasn't worth the conflict. She wasn't looking for credit. She just wanted the business to survive. She didn't need her name on the door. Now, she knew better. That afternoon, she drove to a local print shop on Capitol Hill. The air inside smelled of ink and binding glue, the kind of scent that reminded her of proposal packets and vendor agreements. She approached the counter and asked the young man with the septum piercing if they did custom lettering. Sure do, he said, tapping at a screen. For an office door or a wall? Both, she said. And a logo. He raised an eyebrow with a curious smile. Starting something new? She hesitated, then smiled softly. No. Just putting my name where it should have been. He nodded, not asking anything else. She sketched a few notes, gave him the name, and left with a quote and a pickup time. That night, she pulled her old business files from the basement, the ones she'd boxed up after the separation. Contracts, permits, spreadsheets, and dozens of client evaluations. She'd saved every piece of it. Not for nostalgia, but for evidence. Proof that she had always done the work. The next morning, she called Anna. Hey, her daughter answered, surprised. Do you remember the consulting work I did for that modular housing firm in Tacoma? Margaret asked. Yeah. You helped them navigate zoning code, right? Margaret smiled. I'm thinking of starting something again. Nothing huge. Just a small advisory practice. For developers and small contractors who can't afford a big legal team. There was a pause. Then, excitement. Mom, that's incredible. You'd be amazing at that. I was amazing at it, she said gently. I just stopped believing it mattered. Anna didn't respond right away. But Margaret heard her breathe, heard the weight of those years catch and release in her daughter's chest. Can I help? Anna finally asked. Logo, website, anything. I'd love to. Margaret blinked quickly, warmth blooming behind her ribs. I'd like that. A week later, the decal arrived, white vinyl script on clear adhesive. She drove it out to the small office space she'd just signed a 6-month lease on. A modest place in a shared suite downtown, with soft light and a second-hand desk. She stood in front of the glass door, hands steady, and pressed the lettering against the glass. Fletcher Consulting underneath it, Contract Strategy and Trust Advisory Estate 2025. It wasn't flashy. But it was hers. As she stepped inside and closed the door behind her, she took a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't about winning. It was about presence. She was here now. Name on the door. Hands on the reins. Voice clear, and for the first time in years, Margaret Fletcher was not letting anyone speak on her behalf. The office smelled like fresh paint and ambition. The walls were still bare, save for a framed blueprint from a 2003 housing project Margaret had once rescued from a permitting disaster, something she'd kept all these years, folded neatly. In a storage bin, waiting for a reason to matter again, the coffee maker hissed to life. She leaned on the edge of her new desk, watching steam rise in soft tendrils from the ceramic mug she brought from home. It read, "Keep going, anyway." A gift from Anna years ago. Back then, Margaret had seen it as encouragement to survive. Now, it felt like a quiet nudge toward building. The business email had been live for 3 days. The phone, untouched, sat silent at the corner of the desk like a coiled question. She told herself it would take time. Word of mouth was slow. Referrals. Even slower. But still, she checked the inbox more than she wanted to admit. At 10:42 a.m. on Thursday, it rang. She stared at it for a second, then picked up. This is Margaret Fletcher, she said, steady but tentative. Hi, Ms. Fletcher. My name's Jordan Park. I got your information from a contractor friend of mine, Lisa Vega? She said you helped her out with some city inspection paperwork last year. Margaret's memory clicked into place. Lisa had been one of the few subcontractors who still reached out to her directly during the last year of her marriage. They'd met at a construction law seminar, bonded over mutual frustrations with red tape, and exchanged emails after Margaret guided her through a tricky compliance waiver for a school renovation in Kent. Yes, Margaret said, sitting up straighter. Of course. Lisa mentioned she might pass my name along. What can I help you with? Jordan's voice was fast, clipped with stress. I'm trying to open a mixed-use development just outside Everett, 2 stories, residential over retail. We're 2 weeks from final review and the city's kicked it back. They're flagging our pedestrian access clause and threatening to revoke the permit if we don't resubmit. I've got no idea how to fix it without losing my mind or paying another $5,000 to a firm that won't return my calls. Margaret already had a pen in her hand. What's the exact language of the clause they flagged? There was a rustle of papers on the other end. Jordan read aloud, stumbling a bit through legalese. Margaret listened closely, eyes narrowing. As familiar patterns emerged, standard access easement language that most contractors misunderstood because cities wrote it in deliberately opaque terms. That's a 14.2c conflict, she said, almost to herself. You've got a contradiction between your private ingress allowance and the city's multi-use requirement. You can resolve it with an auxiliary easement memo and a revised Section C proposal. I can walk you through the language and help file the addendum. Jordan was quiet for a second. Seriously? Yes. I've done it before. God. Yes. Please. Whatever your hourly rate is, I'm in. Margaret didn't smile. Not yet. But she felt the edges of something quiet and solid click into place. They scheduled a call for the next morning. She sent over a sample clause, a templated form she'd written herself during her years at RNM, and a short breakdown of the fees, nothing extravagant, just fair. Earned. After the call, she sat back in her chair, watching the city hum just beyond her window. She'd chosen this office partly for its view, not panoramic, but alive. You could see the buses turning onto the viaduct, people hustling between coffee shops and job sites. She imagined Jordan now, somewhere north of Seattle, exhaling for the first time all week. Someone had picked up the phone. Someone knew what to do. Her phone buzzed again, not a call this time, but a text from Anna, image, a photo of a clean, minimalist logo draft, M. Fletcher Consulting in slate gray serif. With a thin underline and the words clarity, advocacy, precision. Below it, text, thought you might like this version. Want me to send it to the printer? Margaret stared at the screen for a long moment. The font reminded her of court documents, sharp, deliberate, formal. But the words beneath it felt new. Warm. Rooted. She typed back, it's perfect. Let's do it. She set the phone down. Outside, someone was laughing, clear, brief, unscripted. A construction worker leaning against a truck was on the phone, telling someone a story. Margaret couldn't hear the words. But the shape of the moment was familiar. There was still life in this work. Still dignity in the scaffolding. Still purpose. In the documents and clauses and ink, this wasn't about rebuilding from nothing. It was about finally building something that had her name on it from the beginning. The envelope arrived in late August, cream-colored, thick paper, no return address. Margaret found it wedged between a grocery store flyer and her water bill. She knew the handwriting instantly. Roberts, the loops in the R. The way he pressed too hard on downstrokes, making the paper wrinkle faintly beneath his pen. For a moment, she stood by the mailbox without breathing, fingers tightening around the envelope until it bent slightly. It had been nearly 3 months since the ruling. No contact. No statements. Just the abrupt end of a long, bitter chapter. She brought it inside, laid it on the kitchen table, and stared at it while the kettle heated. She didn't want to open it right away. Not because she feared what was inside, but because of what it might stir loose. Some part of her hoped it was an apology. Another part braced for manipulation disguised as remorse. She made her tea. Saturday. Watched the shadows shift on the hardwood, then finally, she slid a letter opener under the flap and pulled the single sheet free. Margaret, I debated whether to send this. You don't owe me a reply. I understand that. I've had time, more than I wanted, less than I deserve, to look back at what happened. At what I did. I used to believe that running a business meant making hard decisions without apology. I thought efficiency mattered more than fairness. That was a lie I told myself because it let me win. And I liked winning more than I liked sharing credit. When I signed the revised trust, I didn't read it fully. I trusted you would always do what was best for the family. I realize now how entitled that was. How much I relied on your steadiness while ignoring your voice. What you did in that courtroom, it forced me to listen. I've told myself for years that the smirk was part of the game. But it was cruelty. I see that now. I'm not writing to undo what's been decided. I'm writing because if there's anything left of who we used to be, if there's still a corner of you that can believe I once loved you, I want to say this, I'm sorry. For the name on the door. For the meetings you weren't invited to. For letting the silence grow between us. I hope you find peace in this new chapter. Robert. She read it once. Then again, the letter was clean, careful. No demands. No arguments. Just words he should have said 20 years ago, written now that they no longer had consequence. She set it down on the table, folded it in half, and pushed it away. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just let it sit there, its presence. More interesting than its content. Apologies were strange things, sometimes more about the sender than the recipient. What he wanted, Margaret suspected, wasn't forgiveness. It was acknowledgement. Closure. A soft edge to the story that had made him the antagonist in so many people's eyes, but real closure didn't come from letters. It came from choices, and Margaret had made hers. The next day, she walked into her office and saw the new sign Anna had sent, polished acrylic mounted beside the door, the logo printed with a precision that felt permanent now. M. Fletcher Consulting. Below it, in crisp lettering, trust. Strategy. Advocacy. She opened her inbox. 2 new client referrals. One from a non-profit group looking to convert vacant buildings into low-income housing. The other from a woman launching her first commercial renovation project and afraid of being taken advantage of. Margaret replied to both, setting up calls and preparing documentation. Each file she opened, each clause she read, reminded her, this work was real. Tangible. Clear. That evening, she went home and retrieved Robert's letter from the kitchen table. She read it one last time, then she slid it into a manila folder marked personal, closed, and filed it in the cabinet under her desk. Not as a keepsake. Not as a wound. Just as a record. He had spoken. She had listened, but she didn't need to speak back. Silence, when chosen, can be its own reply. By early September, Seattle's air had changed. The mornings were cooler, crisp with the first hints of fall. Margaret noticed it in the way the sun stretched longer shadows across the sidewalk outside her office, in the soft rustle of yellow Leaves beginning to gather in corners of the street. The inbox was steady now, 3, sometimes 4 inquiries a week. Mostly small developers, first-time homeowners, or non-profit groups. Word had spread in quiet, confident circles. She knows the fine print. She's the one who'll actually explain it to you. On Monday morning, she arrived early, her coffee still steaming in hand, to find a small white envelope on the floor just inside the door. It had been slid under the threshold. Her name was written in neat, slanted cursive. Inside, a folded resume and a handwritten note. Dear Ms. Fletcher, my name is Talia Nguyen. I'm a third-year student at UW, studying urban planning. I've been following your consulting work. Lisa Vega spoke about you in one of our seminars. I know I don't have industry experience yet, but I've read 3 of your published articles on contract negotiation and tenant equity. I want to learn from someone who doesn't just know the law, but knows what it's like to have to fight for it to mean something. I can volunteer, shadow, organize your files, anything. I just want to be in the room. With respect and admiration. Talia. Margaret held the paper in both hands for a long moment, eyes scanning the tight, earnest handwriting. She wasn't used to being the one looked up to. For years, she had been the hidden hand, the back-office brain, the silent stabilizer. Even during the court battle, she had never once thought of herself as a mentor, but something in the letter felt different. Not flattery. Hunger. A young woman asking for a seat at the table. By noon, she had written back and invited Talia in for a conversation that Thursday, when the girl arrived, wearing a second-hand blazer and nervous excitement. Like perfume, Margaret saw something familiar in her. Not just intelligence, but a need to prove she belonged in rooms that didn't always welcome her. They talked for over an hour. Talia spoke quickly, clearly. She'd grown up in Spokane, raised by a single mother who cleaned office buildings at night. She'd watched her landlord neglect basic repairs for years while raising rent twice. That's why I picked this field, she said. Because cities are just contracts written in concrete. I want to understand how the language works before someone else writes over me. Margaret nodded slowly. You understand more at 20 than I did at 30, she said. But knowing how it works and surviving inside it are 2 different things. If you're willing to listen, I'll teach you both. Talia's eyes widened. Really? Margaret smiled. Bring a pen. They started with simple tasks, filing, formatting case notes, summarizing city codes. But after 2 weeks, Margaret handed her a real document, a revised land use agreement for a family-owned grocery store trying to stay open after a redevelopment project threatened their lease. I want you to rewrite this in plain English, Margaret said. Pretend you're explaining it to your mother. Talia's hands trembled slightly as she took it. Okay. That evening, Margaret stayed late. She brewed a second cup of tea and watched the reflection of her office in the darkened window, papers spread neatly across the desk, a small second chair pulled close to her own, filled now by someone eager to learn. It felt like legacy. Not in the grand, corporate sense, but in the way a woman who had been silenced now passed down the ability to speak clearly, precisely, and without fear. Later that week, as they packed up for the day, Talia hesitated at the door. Can I ask you something? She said. Of course. Is it true? What people say about the courtroom? That you stood up and just read the clause? Margaret paused. Yes. I read it. And he didn't say anything? Margaret turned off the light, locking the door behind them. He didn't need to, she said. That clause was the first sentence I ever said that he couldn't interrupt. Talia walked beside her in silence as they stepped into the fading light of the early evening. The streets glowed with a soft orange hue. Construction workers packed up for the day. Office windows flickered off one by one. And somewhere deep in the city, deals were still being made, some fair, many not. But in this little pocket of downtown, a door now bore a woman's name who had once been written out, and right beside it, a second name would one day follow. The rain was heavy that morning. Seattle gray. Relentless. Margaret watched it beat against the window while Talia sat across from her, fidgeting with the edge of a printed contract. They had just come off a long week, 3 consultations in 5 days, all involving projects with shaky ethics and tense undercurrents. But this one, the file on the table now, felt different. Heavier. Personal. Walk me through it again, Margaret said. Talia nodded, her voice low. It's a small, multi-unit development out in West Seattle. The client wants to convert a rundown fourplex into upscale townhomes. On paper, it looks clean. Permits are active. Zoning's fine. And? Talia shifted. The tenants. They're all still there. No relocation plan, no notice timeline. I asked the project lead about it. He said they'd handle it quietly. Margaret didn't respond. She just stared at her, letting the silence stretch. They want me to draft the buyout letters, Talia added. But they're not buyouts. They're pressure notes. Deadline notices wrapped in legal niceties. She tapped the top of the page with her pen. Her voice cracked slightly when she said it. It doesn't feel right. That was the moment. The one Margaret had seen coming since she took Talia on. The first ethical fork in the road. The kind that doesn't show up in textbooks, only in real life, quiet and unassuming, like a casual task with a clock ticking behind it. Margaret leaned back in her chair. Do you want to say no? She asked. I do. But I'm not sure I'm allowed to. You're not an employee. You're not a machine. You get to draw the line. Talia swallowed hard. But if I say no, doesn't that mean we lose the client? Maybe, Margaret said. But we keep something else. She reached across the table and gently pulled the file toward her. She scanned the opening paragraph, standard redevelopment boilerplate, vague enough to protect the firm, specific enough to shake a family loose from their apartment without saying the words outright. This is how people get pushed out, she said. Not by bulldozers. By soft letters with polite fonts. By market shifts and urban renewal and language that hides its violence. She looked up. You noticed it. That's the job. Talia's face was flushed now, but her jaw was set. Margaret stood, walked to the cabinet behind her desk, and pulled out a file labeled Ethical Review, Declined Projects. Inside were 6 contracts from the last 18 months, jobs Margaret had walked away from. One was a complex involving public land reallocation with dubious board members. Another was a quiet shell company trying to exploit ADA compliance loopholes. She handed the folder to Talia. These were losses, she said. But they're also the reason I sleep at night. Talia didn't speak. She just nodded slowly, her eyes scanning the files. There was relief in her face, but also something else, responsibility. The awareness that doing this work right would cost her sometimes. That staying clear came with a price. Margaret sat again, folding her hands. I'll call the project manager, she said. I'll tell him we're stepping back. You don't have to. I do, Margaret said. Because if you're learning from me, you're learning all of it. Including when to walk. The next day, Margaret sent the email. Simple. Professional. Firm. Subject. Withdrawal from Project 1834. Dear Mr. Lanning, upon review of the current project goals and the tenant transition approach proposed, M. Fletcher Consulting will not be able to proceed further. We support responsible development. But we do not participate in displacement. Best, Margaret Fletcher. She copied Talia. An hour later, her phone buzzed. A brief reply. Understood. Disappointed, but expected. Margaret stared at the screen for a moment, then turned it off and set it aside. Across the desk, Talia was working quietly, updating a case file for another client, a community art collective. Trying to rezone a vacant warehouse into a mixed-use space. You okay? Margaret asked. Talia nodded. Yeah, I think so. Margaret paused. You did the right thing. Talia looked up, her voice soft but sure. I know. And Margaret smiled, not wide, not for show. But a quiet, proud curve of her lips that said more than approval. It said you're ready. That evening, after locking up, Margaret walked the long way to the parking garage. Rain still drizzled over the city, soft and steady. She passed scaffolding, neon-lit storefronts, and men in reflective vests packing up. After another day's build. The kind of work she understood. The kind you could measure. But what they'd done today, drawing a line in invisible ink, that mattered just as much. It reminded her of what her mentor had once told her, long ago, back when she was still learning to speak up. Integrity is invisible most of the time. Until someone looks back and sees what's still standing. Now, Margaret was the one shaping what would stand. It was a Thursday when the interview request came. Margaret had just finished her second coffee when the email arrived. Subject line simple, direct, Seattle Women in Law and Business, feature profile inquiry. A young journalist named Claire Donnelly had reached out. She was putting together a series on women over 50 who had reinvented themselves after retirement or major career change. Margaret wasn't sure how they'd found her, maybe through Lisa Vega, or the trust advisory she'd done for that nonprofit, but there she was, in the body of the email. We've heard your story. And we think more people should. Her first instinct was to decline. The work mattered, the attention didn't. But then she thought of Talia. Of how hungry she had been for an example, for a voice that didn't sound polished or rehearsed, but lived in. Honest. Margaret agreed to the interview. They met at a small coffee shop near Capitol Hill. Claire, no older than 28, brought a small recorder and a notebook already full of scribbles. She had done her homework. I know about the courtroom moment, Claire said. That clause? That line in the trust? Everyone talks about that. But that's not what I want to lead with. Margaret raised an eyebrow. No? Claire smiled. No. That's the crescendo. I want to start with the years before that. With what it's like to keep doing the right thing even when no one's looking. I want to talk about the years you kept receipts. The contracts no one read but you. The silence. Margaret leaned back, surprised by how seen she felt. They spoke for almost 2 hours. She told Claire about the early days of R&M, about the language she'd written into deals while her name vanished from press releases. She talked about Clause 14b, yes, but only as one of 100 quiet acts of preparation. She spoke, too, about the price of endurance. About how easy it is to mistake being reasonable for being erased. And how, one day, she simply stopped apologizing for taking up space. At the end, Claire asked, "What would you tell someone like me? A woman just starting out?" Margaret thought for a long time. "Be meticulous," she said. "People will call it overthinking. They'll say you're too cautious, too careful, too precise. Let them. Keep records. Keep notes. Don't rush to fill silence just because someone else is comfortable in it." She paused, then added, "And remember that doing your job well won't always be enough to make people respect you. But do it well anyway. Because one day, when it matters most, the truth will be in your hands, and no one will be able to talk over it." Claire blinked. Then nodded, as if memorizing it. The article came out a week later. It was simple, elegant, and powerful. Not a profile in vengeance, but in clarity. Margaret's photo sat at the top, taken in her office, next to the new sign, with the quote in bold beneath it: "The truth, once spoken clearly, can silence even the loudest egos." Anna called the moment it went live. "I cried in the middle of a staff meeting," she said. "Seriously. I don't know if it was pride or rage or both, but I just sat there and thought, my mom did this." Margaret laughed quietly. "You sound like you've been holding that in for years," Anna said. "And Mom?" "Yes. I think it's time I added Fletcher back into my professional name." Margaret's throat tightened. She said nothing at first. Then, "Only if you want to." "I want to," Anna said. That evening, Margaret took a walk alone through her neighborhood. The leaves had turned in earnest, amber and russet spilling onto sidewalks like something ending gracefully. Children's voices echoed from porches. A man walked past holding hands with a little girl who looked exactly like Anna had at 5. Margaret smiled at them. She passed her old church, the bench where she used to sit during lunch breaks and ask herself whether it was too late to start over. It wasn't. She passed the building where her old law firm used to lease conference rooms. She used to dread those meetings. Now, her name was on the other side of town. On glass. On contracts. On people's lips. Eventually, she circled back to her home. Quiet. Warm. Hers. In the living room sat a box she hadn't opened in years, labeled "Old Office, Robert." She'd always meant to sort it or throw it away. Instead, she pulled out a single item, a brass nameplate, "Robert Fletcher, Managing Director." She held it in her hands for a moment, then set it gently in the donation pile near the door. He could take back the title. She had taken back everything else.